Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
The night had a softness that wrapped around the town like a velvet shawl. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the streets glistening beneath the pale glow of the streetlights. A low mist hovered, shifting gently with each passing breath of wind. At the end of a narrow cobblestone lane stood a cafe that wasn't always there. Some nights it appeared, some nights it didn't. Those who had stumbled upon it often questioned later if they had dreamed it. But on this particular night, the Midnight Garden Cafe waited with its lanterns flickering faintly, and its windows glowing with warmth that invited the weary, the lost, and the sleepless. Clara had been walking for hours, her shoes damp and her mind restless. The world outside had grown too heavy, endless work, endless noise, endless motion. She only wanted silence, but even in her apartment, the hum of the city crawled under her skin. That night, without much thought, she had stepped outside and walked until the familiar streets began to fade. She didn't know how long she had been walking when she saw the soft amber light spilling from a window at the end of the lane. The sign above the door was made of dark wood, the words etched in gold. The Midnight Garden Cafe. It was delicate, almost shimmering as though painted with moonlight. Through the foggy glass she could see silhouettes moving. Someone wiping a counter, another figure seated by the window, steam curling from a teacup. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. A small bell chimed, a sound so clear and comforting that it seemed to quiet her thoughts in an instant. Inside, the air was warmer than she expected. The scent of lavender tea and baked bread drifted toward her, wrapping her in gentle familiarity. The walls were lined with bookshelves and ivy vines that stretched lazily toward the ceiling. Lanterns hung from the beams, their light swaying with the rhythm of the breeze that slipped through the half-open window. There were only a few tables, all wooden and worn smooth by time. A man stood behind the counter, his eyes a calm gray like rain clouds. "Welcome," he said in a voice that sounded like it belonged to the night itself, steady, soft, patient. "You found us." Clara hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even know I was looking." He smiled slightly. "Most don't, but the cafe tends to appear when someone needs it most." She wasn't sure what that meant, but something about the word soothed her. She chose a seat near the window, where a small vase of white flowers rested. The petals shimmered faintly, almost glowing. When she touched one, it felt cool and alive like the air before dawn. The man brought her a cup of tea without asking what she wanted. The mug was handmade, uneven at the edges, yet perfect in its imperfection. Steam spiraled upward, carrying a scent that reminded her of late summer nights in quiet gardens. She took a sip, and for the first time in months, the knot in her chest loosened. Music drifted from somewhere unseen. A soft piano melody, slow and deliberate. The sound didn't fill the room. It simply lingered, the way moonlight lingers on water. The cafe door opened again, letting in a gust of cool air. An elderly man entered, tapping his cane lightly on the floor. The barista, if that's what he was, greeted him with a nod, and the old man smiled as though greeting an old friend. He took a seat by the fire, where an orange cat lay curled on the rug. The cat lifted its head briefly, blinked once, then returned to sleep. Clara sipped her tea and let the sound of the crackling fire pull her deeper into stillness. Every few moments the barista glanced her way, not in intrusion, but as though ensuring she was at peace. Time seemed to slow, then stretch, and then dissolve entirely. She didn't know how long she sat there before she noticed the small details. The clock above the counter had no hands. The candles never melted down, and the mist outside never thinned or thickened. It simply hung in place, unbothered by the hours that might or might not have been passing. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded softer than before. "What is this place?" The man poured her another cup. "It's a place between. A resting stop for wandering souls." "Souls?" she asked with a small, nervous laugh. He smiled faintly. "Not in the way you think. Souls don't always belong to the dead, you see. Sometimes they just get tired of living." The words resonated in her chest like a gentle echo. She looked around at the other patrons, a woman in a long coat staring quietly into her tea, a young boy sketching on a napkin, a couple whispering to each other while holding hands. None of them seemed fully present, yet none seemed absent either. "Do you come here often?" Clara asked the woman beside her. The woman smiled dreamily. "Only when I need to remember who I am." Outside, the mist shifted again, and faintly, through the glass, Clara could see a garden blooming in the darkness. Roses that shimmered blue under the moonlight, vines that glowed faintly, flowers that opened even though there was no sun. The sight pulled her from her thoughts, and she rose to look closer. When she stepped outside, she expected the night air to bite with cold, but it didn't. It was warm, fragrant, alive. The garden stretched far beyond what the cafe size should have allowed. Pathways wound in every direction, and each turn led to something new. A fountain trickling softly, a bench beneath a willow tree, a lantern floating on a small pond that reflected the stars like glass. She felt no fear, only the calm weight of wonder. In the center of the garden stood a small round table with a single candle burning on it. The flame didn't flicker despite the gentle breeze. As she approached, she noticed something written in delicate script along the rim of the candle holder. "Rest a while. Time will wait." She sat there, her eyes tracing the stars reflected in the pond. The night whispered softly, and for once, her thoughts fell silent. She didn't know how long she sat there, nor did it matter. Eventually, she returned to the cafe, where the man behind the counter greeted her with a quiet nod. "The garden liked you," he said simply. She smiled. "It feels familiar." "It always does," he replied. "It's built from memories of peace. Everyone sees it a little differently." The other patrons had vanished. The fireplace burned low, and the cat had moved to her chair, purring quietly. Clara smiled, almost laughing at the gentle audacity of it. The barista began cleaning the counter again. The sound of his cloth against was steady and rhythmic. She stood unsure of what to say. "Will this place still be here tomorrow?" He looked up, his eyes kind. "For you? Only if you need it." She hesitated by the door, her hand resting on the frame. "Thank you." "No need," he said. "You found your quiet." Outside, the mist had lifted slightly. The cobblestone glistened under the moonlight, and though she turned to glance back, the cafe was already gone. Only the faint scent of lavender and warm bread lingered in the air, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt light, unburdened, as if she had left something behind she no longer needed. As she walked home, the moon followed her, round and serene, and somewhere behind the veil of stars, she thought she heard that same faint piano melody drifting on the wind. And somewhere, when the night deepened and the world fell asleep, the Midnight Garden Cafe would open its doors once more, waiting for another weary soul who needed to rest. The wind was gentle that night, brushing softly against the cobblestones like fingertips trailing over a memory. The scent of jasmine and distant rain floated through the air, carrying something unnameable, something old and tender, as though the night itself remembered every story it had ever held. The town had gone quiet, save for the occasional hum of faraway cars and the sigh of leaves against each other. Yet down a narrow lane that most people overlooked, the faint glow of lanterns shimmered through the mist, revealing a hidden doorway. Above it, gold letters spelled out a name that seemed to shimmer with its own quiet light. The Midnight Garden Cafe. Clara hadn't meant to find it. Her thoughts had been too loud, her heart too full, and the city too unkind. She had wandered without destination, her hands buried in her coat pockets, her breath visible in the chill. The world around her blurred as she walked street after street of identical lights, empty bus stops, shuttered shops, and her own reflection trailing faithfully in every darkened window. She hadn't realized how far she had gone until she turned a corner and saw that soft glow waiting in the mist. It wasn't a light like the harsh white of city lamps or the cold flicker of neon signs. This was gentler, warmer, like the flame of a candle kept alive through years of storms. Drawn by something she couldn't name, Clara stepped closer. The door of the cafe was painted midnight blue, and ivy curled around its frame. The windows were fogged, but she could make out the silhouettes of movement. Someone pouring tea, a hand turning a page, a flicker of laughter she could almost hear. She hesitated only a moment before pushing open the door. The bell that chimed above her head was delicate, its sound clear but not sharp, like the ringing of glass in water. The warmth inside enveloped her instantly. The air smelled of chamomile, honey, and rain-soaked earth. Candles glowed in jars, softening every shadow, and a faint piano melody drifted from somewhere unseen. The walls were covered with shelves of books, vines, and framed sketches of gardens under moonlight. A man behind the counter looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words to be kind. His gray eyes carried the calm of a cloudy morning, and his hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though time was not something he ever needed to chase. "Welcome," he said. "It's been a while since we've had someone new." Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. "I was just walking. I didn't mean to." He shook his head softly. "No one ever does. But the midnight garden finds those who need it." He poured tea from a porcelain pot into a cup that seemed to warm her hands before she even touched it. She sat at a table near the window, the mist outside a faint silver curtain. Every sound in the cafe felt like part of a dream. The turning of pages, the gentle stir of spoons, the whisper of the fire in the hearth. Across the room, an elderly woman sat knitting beside a sleeping cat. A young man read quietly, his face softened by candlelight. No one spoke loudly, but there was an intimacy in the silence, as though everyone here was bound by the same secret. Clara took her first sip of tea. It was unlike any tea she'd had before. Not sweet, not bitter, but something in between. It tasted of warmth and stillness, and of something she couldn't name. As she exhaled, the ache she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying began to loosen, like knots undone by invisible hands. Hours or minutes might have passed before she looked up and realized that the rain outside had stopped completely. The mist had thinned enough to reveal what lay beyond the windows. A garden blooming under the light of the moon. Petals shimmered faintly in shades of silver and blue, and vines climbed up trellises made of what looked like glass. The sight was impossible. It had not been there before, but it filled her with a strange peace. She rose, drawn to it, and the man behind the counter nodded as if granting permission. "Go ahead," he said softly. "The garden likes visitors." She stepped outside, expecting a chill, but the air was warm and fragrant. The garden seemed endless, the pathways glowing faintly beneath her feet as though lit by the stars. She wandered past flowers that pulsed with gentle light, past trees whose leaves hummed quietly when the wind touched them. There were benches nestled beneath archways, and the sound of water trickling somewhere unseen. The deeper she walked, the lighter her heart felt, as though she was slowly being unburdened of everything she had brought with her. She found a small pond at the garden's heart, its surface so still that the reflection of the moon looked like a perfect pearl resting in dark glass. Floating lanterns drifted lazily across it, their flames unbothered by the night air. A wooden table stood nearby, holding a single candle that burned steadily despite the breeze. Around its base, carved into the wood, were words so fine she almost missed them. "Rest a while. Time will wait." She sat beside it, closing her eyes. For a moment or an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of her breathing and the heartbeat of the night. The worries that had filled her, emails unanswered, dreams deferred, words unsaid, melted into the quiet. She did not need to think or speak or plan. She simply existed, and that was enough. When she finally returned to the cafe, it was nearly empty. The fire burned low. The cat now sprawled lazily across the counter, and the man behind it polishing a teapot. He looked up and met her gaze with a knowing smile. "The garden suits you," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "I think I could stay there forever." He shook his head gently. "No one stays forever, but it will stay with you." She paid without realizing it, leaving behind a few coins she didn't remember carrying. The bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped back into the mist. When she turned around, the cafe was gone. Only the faint scent of tea and lavender lingered in the air, dissolving slowly into the night. Clara stood for a while, staring at the space where it had been, unsure if she had dreamed it all. But when she looked down at her hand, she noticed something. A small petal, glowing faintly silver, resting against her palm. The weeks that followed moved slower, softer. The noise of the city no longer felt like an intrusion. When things grew heavy, Clara would close her eyes and smell lavender and rain. Some nights she thought she heard a faint piano melody drifting through her window, though she never could find its source. She told no one about the Midnight Garden Cafe. Somehow she knew she didn't need to. It wasn't a place you could search for. It found you only when you needed to rest, when your heart had forgotten how to be still. Some said it appeared at the edge of forgotten towns or down quiet roads where the streetlights flickered. Others said it could appear anywhere. A park at dusk, a fog-covered bridge, even within a dream. But those who had found it never truly lost it. They carried a piece of its calm within them, a reminder that peace was not something to chase, but something that waited patiently, just beyond the noise. And so, under the endless rhythm of the world as clocks turned and days blurred, the Midnight Garden Cafe continued to exist, somewhere between memory and moonlight, its doors quietly opening each night for those who wandered too far from themselves, offering them a cup of warmth, a quiet garden, and the chance to rest until morning. The moon had begun its slow descent across the sky, and the faintest suggestion of dawn lingered far beyond the horizon. Yet in the quiet folds of the night, time moved differently around the Midnight Garden Cafe. Hours stretched and curled like smoke, dissolving in the fragrance of tea and rain. Inside, the candles burned with steady patience, their light gliding over the polished wood of the tables, dancing on the walls as though it too were listening to the whispers that lingered between the guests. Clara had left her mark without knowing it. The chair where she had sat still held a faint warmth, and the teacup she'd touched shimmered slightly before the man behind the counter, whose name was Ezra, lifted it and placed it among the others. He had run this cafe longer than he could remember. Not in years, but in nights. Time didn't quite behave here. It folded in on itself like a gentle wave, and those who entered left lighter, though never the same. The garden outside rustled softly, aware of the changing rhythm of things. Dew gathered on the petals of silver blossoms, and the pond reflected the sky with the devotion of a mirror in love. Soon another traveler would find their way here. It always happened that way. Someone whose heart had been too long in motion, searching without knowing what for. It was near 2 in the morning when the next visitor came. The rain had returned, falling with a quiet persistence, and through it a man walked slowly, his coat collar turned up, his shoulders heavy with the weariness of years. His name was Thomas, though he had long since stopped introducing himself to strangers. The world had felt too loud lately, too sharp around the edges. He was a carpenter by trade, his hands strong but his spirit dulled by the endless repetition of days. He hadn't planned to be out so late, but his feet had taken him away from his workshop, away from the sawdust and silence, toward the faint glow that shimmered like a mirage at the end of a rain-slick street. When he saw the cafe, he thought at first it must be closed. The mist seemed to hold it apart from everything else, like an island adrift in the air. But then the golden light in the windows flickered, and a hum of music reached his ears. He pushed the door open, and warmth poured over him like the first breath after waking from a long sleep. Ezra looked up from behind the counter, eyes kind but knowing, as though he had been expecting him. "Welcome," he said simply. Thomas hesitated, his fingers tightening around the strap of his worn satchel. "I wasn't looking for anything," he murmured. Ezra's smile deepened slightly. "No one ever is. But you found something, didn't you?" Thomas looked around the cafe. It was softly alive, the sound of rain against the windows, the crackle of fire, the murmur of unseen leaves outside. He noticed the books on the shelves, each bound differently, some with names he didn't recognize. A single cat slept near the hearth, its tail twitching in dreams. The air was laced with the scent of mint and cinnamon, and the walls glowed as though they had absorbed the laughter and silence of hundreds of nights before. Ezra poured him a cup of tea and placed it on the counter. "Sit where you like," he said. "The chairs remember who needs them most." Thomas chose a table by the window, the one where Clara had once sat. The cup before him steamed faintly, and when he took a sip, it was like tasting the memory of a day long gone. The sweetness of sunlight on his mother's porch, the sound of rain on the old tin roof, the peace he hadn't felt since youth. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sinking as though the weight he carried had begun to ease. He stayed for hours or perhaps minutes. He couldn't tell. Ezra spoke only when needed, and Thomas found comfort in the quiet company. Eventually, Ezra set a second cup on the table and nodded toward the garden. "It's waiting," he said softly. Thomas stood and stepped outside, the air thick with the scent of wet soil and night-blooming flowers. The pathway glowed beneath his feet, leading him deeper into the garden's heart. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, their flames like little suns caught in glass. He followed the sound of water until he reached a small bridge over a stream that hadn't been there before. He leaned against the railing and listened. The world seemed to hold its breath. In the reflection of the stream he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had once been. A young man with steady hands and wide eyes, building a cradle for a child who had never come to be. His heart tightened, but the pain felt softer somehow, like a song remembered rather than a wound reopened. He whispered into the night, "I thought I forgot." The wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of rosemary and pine, and though no one answered, he felt as though something had heard him. When he returned to the cafe, Ezra was lighting another candle. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked. Thomas hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe not what I needed, but what I'd lost." Ezra nodded. "That's enough." Thomas finished his tea and stood to leave. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped into the rain. He looked back once, but the cafe had already dissolved into the mist, leaving only the faint shimmer of light that lingered a moment longer before fading too. In the days that followed, Thomas found his hands steady again. He began to build small things, a birdhouse, a chair, a box for no reason at all. His neighbors noticed something different about him, though none could say what. At night, when the rain came, he would sometimes pause and listen, half expecting to hear the soft chime of a bell or the hum of quiet music carried on the wind. Back in the hidden lane, the Midnight Garden Cafe remained. Ezra moved slowly behind the counter, polishing cups, tending the fire, waiting with the patience of stars. The garden outside shifted with the season, blooming in ways that defied time. Every petal shimmered with memory, every leaf hummed faintly with stories. And as the clock passed 3, the door creaked again. Another traveler entered, a woman in her 30s, her face marked by exhaustion, her eyes heavy from sleepless nights. She carried a sketchbook under her arm, pages filled with unfinished drawings. The world had grown too fast for her, and her art had fallen silent. Ezra smiled as though he already knew her story. "Welcome," he said. "You're right on time." She blinked, confused. "But it's past 3. He chuckled softly. "Time doesn't work the same here. Sit." You look like someone who's forgotten how to breathe." She smiled despite herself, settling into a chair near the fire. The cat stretched lazily and curled at her feet. When she opened her sketchbook, the lines on the page began to shift in the candlelight. Flowers bloomed between her drawings, roots curling softly over her unfinished sketches. She watched in awe, her breath catching in her throat. Ezra brought her a cup of lavender tea. "The garden remembers what we dream," he said gently. "Sometimes it helps us draw it out again." Outside, the moon drifted lower, and the stars began to fade. But inside the Midnight Garden Cafe, time remained unbroken. The woman began to sketch anew, her hand guided by something greater than thought, her lines flowing like river water. Ezra watched quietly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a secret smile. He had seen this many times before. People came carrying the noise of the world, and when they left, they carried the silence instead. The good kind, the kind that heals. And when dawn finally brushed the edge of the sky, when the mist began to thin and the air cooled, the Midnight Garden Cafe once again closed its doors, disappearing into the folds of morning light. But for those who had entered, its scent remained, the faint trace of rain and jasmine, a reminder that somewhere between night and dawn, there exists a place where time waits, where hearts rest, and where even the tiredest souls remember what it means to be still. The sky outside the cafe melted into soft grays and silvers, the rain easing into a faint drizzle that whispered against the windows like a lullaby. Inside, the candles burned low, their flames flickering gently in rhythm with the music that played somewhere unseen. The woman with the sketchbook, whose name was Elise, let her pencil move without thinking. She had forgotten what it felt like for her hands to follow her heart instead of her doubts. Every line she drew seemed to bloom into something alive. Branches curling into existence, stars falling between the pages, faces she didn't remember sketching now smiling faintly from the corners of her paper. Ezra watched her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. He never interrupted those who found their way here. He knew the cafe did the work itself. It listened, it soothed, it reminded people of something quiet and essential, the part of themselves they had long silenced. He stepped outside into the garden, feeling the dew under his shoes. The night air was filled with the scent of jasmine and damp leaves. Each time he breathed in, he felt the same peace that had held him since the cafe had found him all those years ago. He couldn't remember exactly when he had arrived. There had been a storm, a long road, and a deep weariness in his bones. He remembered stepping into the warmth of this place and being greeted by someone much like himself, someone who had said only, "You're home." When he awoke the next night, the cafe had become his to tend. The faces changed, but the stories never truly ended. Each guest carried a spark from this place into the world beyond, a faint echo of light that rippled through their lives in unseen ways. Elisa's soft laughter drifted from inside. She was humming now, a melody that wove itself into the hush of the garden. The flowers seemed to respond, their petals unfolding a little wider as though listening. Ezra smiled faintly and returned to his counter. The clock on the wall read a time that didn't exist. Hands poised between hours, ticking softly without moving forward. Elise looked up as he entered. "It's strange," she said, her voice hushed as if not to disturb the calm. "It feels like I've been here for days, but I know I haven't." "Time stretches differently when you stop measuring it," Ezra said. "It waits for you to breathe again." She nodded, her eyes soft. "I thought I'd lost my art forever." He poured her another cup of tea, steam curling like thin silver ribbons. "Nothing is ever lost here," he said. "Just misplaced until you remember where to look." The door opened softly, letting in the faintest breath of cold air. A man stepped inside, shaking off droplets from his coat. His hair was streaked with gray, his face kind but tired. He hesitated at the threshold before Ezra's quiet smile beckoned him forward. "Welcome," he said. The man nodded, taking a seat by the window. He looked around as though the air itself was unfamiliar. "I was just walking," he murmured. "Didn't realize there were any cafes open this late." Ezra set a cup before him. "We're not always here," he said gently, "but we're always open." The man sipped the tea, his hands trembling slightly around the cup. "I used to come to a place like this," he said after a long pause. "When my wife was alive, we'd sit and talk for hours about everything and nothing. I think I came looking for her tonight." The words hung in the air, soft as mist. Elise stopped sketching but didn't look up, letting her pencil rest while she listened. Ezra's eyes held a quiet understanding. Sometimes the heart leads us to where memories can rest. The man smiled faintly, tears glimmering in his eyes. "It feels like she's here somehow." Ezra nodded slowly. "Perhaps she is. The ones we love don't always leave. They just change the way they arrive." The man sat for a while, his eyes tracing the flicker of the candles, the reflection of the garden beyond the window. The flowers outside swayed as though stirred by a gentle wind that wasn't there. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the ache of loss pressing so tightly against his ribs. When he finished his tea, he whispered a quiet thank you and stood to leave. Elise watched him go, her heart full but calm. "Does everyone who comes here find what they're looking for?" she asked softly. "Not always," Ezra said. "Sometimes they find what they didn't know they needed." The night deepened. The clock still refused to move, and yet the sense of time shifted again. Elise closed her sketchbook and stood, stretching slowly. The cat yawned at her feet, blinking sleepily before curling back into a ball. She looked toward the garden, its glow dimming as dawn began to stir at the horizon. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. Ezra smiled. "No one ever does. But the cafe never truly leaves you. It follows quietly, waiting for you to need it again." She reached out and touched the counter, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood as if committing it to memory. Then she turned toward the door. "Thank you," she said. "Rest well," Ezra replied, "and remember to keep some silence for yourself." When she stepped outside, the air was crisp. The city beyond was waking, its hum returning faintly. But where the cafe had stood, there was now only an empty street glistening with rain. Elise smiled, clutching her sketchbook close to her chest. The pages inside seemed warmer than before, as though the lines drawn upon them still glowed faintly with life. Weeks passed, then months, and yet she found herself painting again, each brushstroke carrying the piece she'd found that night. Her work began to change, softer, more alive, infused with light that seemed to breathe. People began to notice, asking her where she found her inspiration, but she never told them. Some things she knew couldn't be explained. Meanwhile, the Midnight Garden Cafe waited quietly for the next traveler. Its windows glowed somewhere beyond time, its tea always warm, its garden always blooming beneath an unchanging moon. Ezra moved through it like a caretaker of dreams, tending to the fire, setting cups on tables where ghosts of laughter still lingered. Sometimes he would pause and look toward the door, as though sensing a new arrival. And without fail, when someone lost or weary found their way through the fog, the cafe welcomed them the same way it always had, with light, warmth, and the gentle reminder that rest is not a luxury, but a right. Beyond the glass, the flowers continued to bloom, their soft light brushing against the walls. Somewhere deep in the garden, the pond shimmered faintly, ripples moving across its surface though no wind blew. Each ripple held a reflection of those who had come and gone, a mosaic of stories bound together by stillness. And when the world outside grew too loud again, when hearts grew restless and dreams too heavy to carry, the cafe would open its doors once more, quietly, patiently, in some forgotten corner of the night, to offer tea, comfort, and a seat beneath the unending hush of stars. The rain returned softly that evening, not as a storm but as a memory. Thin threads of silver falling through the night, stitching the world in quiet patterns. The cafe seemed to hum in rhythm with it, the sound blending with the low crackle of the fire and the faint chime of porcelain cups. Ezra moved slowly behind the counter, polishing a teacup as though it were something sacred. The air was warm with the scent of honey, herbs, and blooming jasmine. Outside, the garden glowed faintly, petals trembling beneath the gentle rain as if each drop carried a secret. A soft knock echoed through the door. Ezra didn't rush to answer. It never took much for the right ones to find their way in. When he opened it, a woman stepped inside, her clothes damp from the rain and her eyes heavy with sleeplessness. She paused just past the threshold, uncertain if she was intruding. "Am I too late?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost beneath the sound of rain. Ezra shook his head with a kind smile. "You're right on time. Everyone arrives when they're meant to." She hesitated, then smiled faintly, her lips trembling from exhaustion. "I didn't even know I was coming here," she murmured, sitting down at a corner table. "My car broke down the road. I started walking and saw the light. It felt strange, like it was calling me." He poured her tea without asking what she preferred, setting it before her with both hands. The steam rose between them like soft breath. "Sometimes the places we find aren't on any map," he said. "They find us when we need them most." She wrapped her fingers around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. The tension in her shoulders eased as she took her first sip, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. Her eyes lifted to the window where the garden shimmered, each flower reflecting the candlelight in ripples of color. "It's beautiful here," she whispered. "Almost too beautiful. Like it's not real." Ezra smiled faintly. "It's real enough to rest in. That's all that matters." The woman nodded slowly, as if those words alone had unknotted something deep within her. She didn't ask questions about where she was or who he was. There was no need. The cafe existed beyond explanation, in the spaces between time and dreaming, where lost hearts came to remember the language of stillness. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in silence. The woman's eyes grew heavy, her breathing deepened, and her head rested against her arm. She fell asleep right there, her tea half finished and still warm. Ezra watched her for a while, his expression gentle. The clock on the wall shimmered faintly, its hands turning backward for a heartbeat before pausing again. The cat stretched from its corner, padding across the floor to curl beside the sleeping woman's chair. It purred softly, a steady rhythm that matched the rain outside. The cafe breathed with them, its light dimming to a deeper, softer gold. When the woman awoke, she found the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean, the sky pale with dawn. Her cup was empty, and the chair beside her was vacant. She stood slowly, unsure if she had dreamt the entire night. There was a note on the counter, written in looping handwriting that felt older than time. "Rest when you can. The world will wait." She folded the note carefully, tucking it into her pocket before stepping outside. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of wet earth and wildflowers. When she turned to look back, the cafe was gone. Only a narrow path remained, winding through the trees toward the faintest light of morning. She smiled, brushing the rain from her hair, and began to walk. Ezra watched from somewhere unseen. He never left the cafe, though sometimes he felt the world shift around him. Every time someone found their way in, a part of their story lingered, woven into the walls, into the scent of the tea, into the flicker of candles that refused to go out. He never asked for their names, yet he remembered each of them. He carried their voices like notes of a melody, soft and endless. That night, after the woman's visit, the cafe fell quiet again. The clock's ticking slowed until it was no longer a sound but a pulse. Ezra sat by the window, his reflection mingling with the garden beyond. Fireflies floated through the air, their light drifting like thoughts not yet spoken. The cat climbed into his lap, and he stroked its fur absently. For a moment he closed his eyes, and the scent of rain mixed with memory. He saw faces, Elise with her sketchbook, the man who came searching for his wife, the girl who found laughter again after years of silence. Each one had left a small, invisible light behind, and those lights shimmered now in the garden outside, glowing between the petals like stars resting on earth. He wondered sometimes if he was just another traveler who had stayed too long. But then he remembered the voice that had welcomed him long ago, the same voice that lived now in the soft hum of the cafe itself. "Someone must keep the door open," it had said. And so he did. Time folded softly, seasons passing without notice. Sometimes snow fell on the garden, each flake lingering longer than it should. Sometimes summer came and stayed, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the hum of bees. People still found their way to the cafe. A weary musician, a young traveler, an old man who could no longer dream. Each one left a story behind, stitched into the quiet fabric of the night. Ezra aged gently, though he never grew truly old. His eyes held centuries of calm, his smile patient and knowing. When he brewed tea, it tasted like comfort and memory and a promise that everything would be all right, even if just for a moment. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the hush of snow and the warmth of firelight. One evening, as the sky bled from blue to violet, he stood in the doorway of the cafe and looked out at the lake beyond. The surface was glass smooth, reflecting both the moon and the faint glow of lanterns strung through the trees. He thought of everyone who had ever passed through these doors, and he whispered a silent farewell to them all, not in grief but in gratitude. The world outside continued, but here within the walls of the cafe, peace was timeless. When the wind shifted, carrying the sound of faraway laughter and the scent of rain, Ezra smiled softly. Somewhere, another traveler was already finding their way toward him, guided by a light they couldn't name. He straightened the chairs, refilled the teapots, and lit the candles once more. The night waited, tender and infinite, and when the door finally opened, letting in a soft breath of cool air and the scent of wildflowers, Ezra looked up with that same quiet kindness that had greeted every soul before. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm and calm as a heartbeat in the dark. "You're right on time." The candles in the cafe flickered, their light wavering like breath as the wind moved gently against the windows. Ezra stood by the counter, his hands resting on the edge of the worn wood. He could feel the quiet hum of the place, that soft, steady pulse that lived beneath the sound of rain and the ticking of the clock. It wasn't just a cafe, not really. It was something older, something that seemed to exist in the folds of dreams and silence. The shelves behind him were lined with glass jars, each filled with herbs, dried petals, and tiny fragments of memory. He had long since forgotten where most of them came from, but sometimes, when he brushed his fingers along their labels, faint whispers would rise, laughter, weeping, or the gentle rustle of someone turning a page. The night grew deeper, and mist began to gather outside. The lake that stretched beyond the garden reflected no stars tonight, only the faint shimmer of the moon breaking through clouds. Ezra could sense the next visitor drawing near before the door even opened. The cafe always knew when someone was coming. It would shift slightly, the air warming, the scent of tea deepening, the fire crackling louder as if in greeting. When the door opened, the bells above it chimed in a slow, melodic way. A young man stepped inside, his coat damp, his hair clinging to his forehead. He looked as though he had been walking for miles. His eyes darted around, not with fear but with confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand where he was. "Is this a cafe?" he asked, his voice quiet, his breath visible in the candlelight. Ezra smiled softly and nodded. "Yes, the Midnight Garden Cafe. You're safe here." The man hesitated before stepping closer. "I didn't see it on the road before. I must have passed here earlier, but it wasn't here then." Ezra poured him tea, something fragrant and golden that shimmered faintly in the cup. "Things have a way of appearing when we need them most," he said. "Please sit." The man obeyed, sitting near the window. His hands were trembling as he reached for the cup, and when he finally took a sip, his eyes softened, the tension in his face loosening like snow melting from branches. It tastes like, I don't know, like something I remember but can't name. That's how it works, Ezra said gently, settling across from him. You've been carrying something heavy. The man nodded, staring into the steam. My father passed away last week. I was supposed to drive home today, but I couldn't. I just kept driving, not knowing where I was going. I think I was trying to get lost. Ezra listened, his expression kind and still. Sometimes, getting lost is how we find what's left of ourselves. The man laughed softly, though it trembled with sadness. You sound like him. He used to say things like that. Always calm, even when everything else fell apart. Then maybe that's why you found this place, Ezra replied. He wanted you to rest for a while. The man didn't respond, but his eyes grew wet. He sat in silence, sipping his tea until the tears slipped quietly down his cheeks. The cafe said nothing. It simply held the moment, warm and forgiving, until the weight began to lift from his shoulders. When the man finally stood, dawn was beginning to touch the horizon. He looked around the cafe one last time, as if trying to memorize it. Thank you, he said softly. I don't even know your name. Ezra smiled faintly. Names aren't so important here. Safe travels, my friend. The man stepped outside, and by the time he looked back, the cafe had disappeared again, replaced by an empty stretch of fog and the first golden light of morning. Inside, Ezra watched the space where the man had been sitting. The chair still held a faint impression, a soft echo of his presence. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of tea and rain. The cat brushed against his leg, and he leaned down to scratch behind its ears. You always know when they're about to leave, he whispered. The cat purred, blinking slowly in agreement. The hours drifted by in silence. The cafe did not sleep, but it rested in its own way. Lights dimmed, fire low, everything breathing in rhythm with the night. Ezra sat by the window, gazing at the garden beyond. The flowers there never withered. They only changed with the moon. Some nights they glowed softly, other nights they shimmered as though made of mist. Each petal seemed to hum with memory. He thought often of the first time he had found the cafe himself. It had been snowing years ago, or perhaps centuries, and he'd been walking through a forest without knowing why. He had been searching for something he'd forgotten. Then, through the snow, he had seen a light flickering in the distance. He'd followed it and found the cafe waiting for him, already warm inside, already set with a cup of tea and a chair by the fire. There had been a woman then, older than he was, with eyes that looked like they had seen the beginning of time. She had smiled at him the way he now smiled at others. It's your turn, she had said. Every keeper needs rest. Mine is done. And then she had left, walking into the snow until she was gone. Ezra had never seen her again. But he had stayed, keeping the cafe open for those who needed it, never aging, never leaving. Sometimes he wondered if one day he too would hand the key to another traveler. But for now he felt no hurry. The world was wide and restless, and there were always those who needed a quiet place to sit, to breathe, to remember. The night deepened again, the moon rising higher, and the cafe came alive with its familiar quiet magic. Candlelight touched the walls in soft gold, and the shadows danced gently, never harsh, never lonely. Outside, the garden swayed in the breeze, and the scent of lavender drifted through the open door. Another visitor was already on their way, a woman walking with a letter in her hand, unsure where to deliver it, her footsteps leading her closer with every heartbeat. The cafe waited, patient as always, its door slightly ajar, its light spilling softly into the darkness. And somewhere within that light, Ezra smiled again, his voice ready, calm and welcoming, as if the night itself spoke through him. Come in, he would say. You found the right place. You're right on time. The night carried a hush that felt almost sacred. Beyond the garden walls, the wind swept through the trees in a slow, graceful rhythm, bending the tall grass and whispering through the leaves. A soft mist had settled across the lake, turning the world outside into something between waking and dream. Inside the cafe, the light remained steady, casting a golden glow that moved like the breath of someone deeply at rest. Ezra stood near the window, his reflection faint in the glass, watching the fog as if it carried stories from places far away. The bell above the door chimed once, a delicate, trembling sound, and he turned. The woman stepped inside hesitantly, clutching a sealed envelope against her chest. Her coat was thin, her eyes tired, and her hands trembled not from cold but from something heavier, a grief that had lingered too long. She looked around as if unsure whether she was intruding, her gaze tracing the shelves of books, the flickering candles, and the gentle cat now curling by the hearth. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly. Ezra smiled with that calm warmth that never faltered. "You haven't disturbed anyone. The cafe is always open to those who need a little rest." She hesitated before walking further in, her shoes leaving faint prints of rain on the wooden floor. The fire crackled as though welcoming her, and she sat down near it, the envelope still in her hands. Ezra moved with quiet purpose, preparing tea the way he always did, as if the act itself was a prayer. The steam rose slowly, curling through the air in fragile spirals. "Chamomile," he said gently as he placed the cup before her. "It's good for hearts that are holding too much." The woman gave a small, broken smile, her eyes glistening. "That's exactly what it feels like." She held the cup for a while without drinking, letting the warmth seep through her fingers. The scent of the tea filled the space between them, soft and comforting. Finally she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "I've been carrying this letter for months. I wrote it for my husband after he passed. I meant to send it to his sister, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Tonight I started walking. I don't even know where I thought I was going." Ezra didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, his eyes steady and kind. "Maybe you were meant to bring it here." She looked down at the envelope. The ink on it was slightly faded, the edges worn from being held too often. "It's just words," she murmured. "But they're all I have left." "Words are never just words," Ezra said softly. "Sometimes they're what keeps us connected to what we've lost." She took a trembling breath, the tears she'd been holding back finally slipping free. They glistened in the candlelight as she set the envelope down and opened it with care. Her voice shook as she began to read aloud. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs, but each word carried years of love, longing, and quiet forgiveness. The cafe listened in silence, the air still, the candles burning lower. When she finished, her voice broke, and she pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes. Ezra waited a moment before speaking. Sometimes the act of speaking their name is enough to set them free. "You've done well to bring it here." Her breathing slowed. The weight she carried began to lift, not all at once, but in small pieces, like snow melting beneath the first light of spring. She wiped her eyes and gave a faint, peaceful smile. "It feels lighter," she whispered, "like I can finally breathe again." "You can," Ezra said. "The cafe has a way of keeping what you no longer need. It holds sorrow gently until it becomes memory." The woman looked toward the window. Outside, the mist was beginning to clear, revealing the faint reflection of dawn spreading across the lake. "I think I can go home now," she said quietly. Ezra nodded. "Home is waiting." She stood, leaving the letter folded on the table. When she opened the door, the air outside was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. The cat stretched lazily as she stepped out, and for a moment she looked back, but the cafe seemed already distant, its glow softening into the mist. Then she walked away, her footsteps fading into the sound of morning birds beginning to stir. Inside, Ezra took the letter and placed it gently into a wooden box beneath the counter. The box was filled with others like it, tokens of stories that had passed through the cafe, each carrying a piece of someone's journey. When he closed the lid, a soft light shimmered through the wood, as though the words within were still alive, still whispering softly to the night. He moved to the window once more, his eyes tracing the horizon where the first blush of dawn kissed the sky. The light touched the garden outside, awakening the flowers from their moonlit slumber. Their petals opened slowly, revealing colors that had only existed in dreams, hues that shifted and shimmered with every breath of wind. Ezra's reflection looked back at him in the glass, older somehow but filled with quiet peace. The cafe behind him breathed gently, the fire low, the shelves glimmering faintly with the glow of bottled memories. He placed a hand against the window, feeling the coolness of the glass and the faint vibration beneath it. It was alive in its own way, pulsing softly like the heart of the night. He whispered to himself almost inaudibly, "We're still here." The cat meowed from beside the hearth, stretching its paws, then leapt gracefully onto the counter. Ezra chuckled softly and poured himself a cup of tea. The warmth seeped through his hands, grounding him in the moment. Outside, the world continued. People waking, roads filling, life moving forward. But within the walls of the Midnight Garden Cafe, time stood perfectly still. For every traveler who would come, for every heart that would seek rest, there would always be this place, waiting, glowing faintly against the endless dark, like a dream that refused to fade. Ezra took a sip of his tea, savoring its soft sweetness. The clock on the wall ticked once, then twice, before settling into silence. And somewhere beyond the mist, another soul began its journey toward him, following a light only visible to those who needed it most. The cafe would open its door once again, the bell would chime softly, and Ezra's calm voice would echo through the quiet, timeless air. "Welcome," he would say with a smile that carried all the warmth of 1,000 sunrises. "You're right on time." The air outside the cafe grew quieter as the last remnants of night folded into dawn. A faint mist lingered over the lake, drifting across the water like a memory refusing to let go. The world seemed to hold its breath in those soft hours, and even the birds sang in whispers. Inside the cafe, the fire had dimmed to glowing embers, painting the wooden walls in shades of amber and gold. Ezra sat by the window with his cup of tea, his gaze distant but peaceful. The warmth of the cup seeped through his fingers, and the rhythmic sound of the cat's purring blended with the gentle hum of morning. Everything felt perfectly still, yet quietly alive. He thought of the woman who had come with her letter. Her face lingered in his mind, not as a clear image but as a feeling, something fragile and luminous, like candlelight seen through glass. Her sorrow had softened into calm before she left, and that was enough. The cafe didn't heal with miracles or grand gestures. It simply gave people a place to breathe, a place to remember that it was okay to stop moving, even if just for a little while. Ezra rose slowly and walked toward the garden. The door creaked softly as he opened it, and the cool morning air embraced him. The flowers shimmered under a light mist, each petal catching the pale light of the new day. Dewdrops clung to the leaves like tiny fragments of glass, and the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine filled the air. He ran his hand along the tops of the flowers, feeling the moisture gather on his fingertips. Beyond the garden, the lake reflected the awakening sky, streaks of rose, silver, and blue rippling with the soft movement of the water. He closed his eyes and listened to the world around him. Somewhere far off, the faint toll of a bell echoed through the valley, the sound drifting like a slow heartbeat. It reminded him that time continued beyond these walls, though the cafe existed in its own rhythm, untouched by the world's urgency. It was neither yesterday nor tomorrow here, only now. The cat followed him outside, padding softly through the damp grass, its fur brushing against his ankle. Ezra smiled and leaned down to scratch behind its ear. "You've been here longer than most," he murmured. The cat blinked at him, its eyes reflecting the lake's soft light. and then it turned its head toward the forest as if sensing something. Ezra followed its gaze. A faint shimmer appeared through the trees, not a light exactly, but a flicker in the air, as though the mist itself were parting for someone unseen. Ezra's heart stirred, though not with surprise. He knew that shimmer. It meant another traveler was on their way. Every visitor brought something different with them. Sometimes sorrow, sometimes longing, sometimes a question that had no words. The cafe did not call to everyone, only those whose hearts were whispering too loudly to ignore. He walked back inside, lighting a few candles even though the sun had begun to rise. The glow warmed the air, softening the shadows that still clung to the corners of the room. He arranged 2 cups on the counter, though only one guest would arrive. It was a quiet ritual of his, a gesture of welcome, an acknowledgement that no one ever truly came alone. Every soul carried with them the echoes of those they had loved, and in this place those echoes were honored. The door opened with a soft sound, and the bell above it chimed once. A young woman stepped inside, wrapped in a faded green coat, her eyes red from crying. She hesitated at the threshold, as though afraid the moment she crossed it, she might shatter something delicate. Ezra's smile was calm and familiar, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "Good morning," he said gently. "You're right on time." She blinked, startled by his words, and looked around. "I don't know how I ended up here," she admitted. "I was driving all night. My car ran out of gas near the woods. I started walking and saw your lights. You're safe now," he said, pouring tea into one of the cups. "Sit. You look like you could use a little warmth." She obeyed, wrapping her hands around the cup and holding it close to her lips. The scent made her shoulders relax almost instantly. "It smells like roses," she murmured. "Roses and something else," he said, his tone gentle. "A little bit of peace, maybe." She gave a small, tired smile and stared into the cup. "It's been a long few weeks," she confessed. "My sister passed away last month. I keep expecting her to call me. Every time the phone rings, I think it's her." Ezra nodded slowly. "When someone we love leaves, they don't go far. They linger in the spaces between moments, in laughter, in dreams, even in silence." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they fell without resistance. She let them come, her breath slow and deep. "She used to love gardens," she said through a trembling laugh. "She always wanted to open a cafe filled with flowers. I told her it was too much work. I guess I was wrong." Ezra's gaze softened. Sometimes dreams find a way to live on, even when the dreamers can't. She looked up, startled, and for a moment she thought she saw something shift in the air around her. The faint outline of petals, the shimmer of light moving like the wings of a butterfly. It lasted only a breath before fading, leaving behind the scent of roses. Her lips parted as she whispered, "Did you see that?" Ezra simply smiled. The cafe has its ways. She stayed for a while longer, sipping her tea in silence. The room seemed to breathe with her, slow, steady, patient. By the time she stood to leave, her face had softened, and her eyes carried the kind of quiet found only after a storm. She thanked him and stepped outside, her figure dissolving slowly into the brightening mist. Ezra stood there a moment longer, the empty cup still steaming faintly on the counter. He felt the faint pulse of the cafe around him. Its warmth, its silence, its infinite kindness. The cat leapt onto the table, curling up beside the empty cup as though claiming the space left behind. Outside, the day broke fully. Sunlight spread across the garden, scattering through the dew until it glittered like stars fallen to earth. Ezra took a deep breath, letting the light fill the room. Every soul who found their way here left a little brightness behind, and he could feel those lights now, lingering in every corner, soft, unseen, but deeply real. He turned toward the window, his reflection blending with the golden morning. The world beyond was vast, filled with endless roads and restless hearts, but here within the Midnight Garden Cafe, time moved with grace. he whispered, as he often did when the cafe was quiet. Rest when you can. The world will wait. Then he went about his work once more, tending to the fire, refilling the teapots, waiting for the next weary traveler to find their way through the fog, drawn by a light they couldn't quite explain, a light that had always been waiting for them. The afternoon light drifted through the cafe windows like liquid gold, slow and soft, carrying a hush that made every sound tender. The wooden beams creaked occasionally, as though stretching in the warmth, and the clock above the counter ticked with a steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Outside, the mist that had once cloaked the lake was lifting, revealing the slow shimmer of water touched by the descending sun. A faint breeze wandered through the open doorway, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves, tea, and something faintly sweet, perhaps honey or memory. Ezra moved quietly, wiping down the counter and setting out new teacups as if he were expecting someone, though no one was in sight. The cat followed him, its tail brushing gently against the legs of the chairs, its green eyes blinking slowly as if it too knew that something or someone was on their way. It was always like this at the cafe. Some arrivals were expected, others were not. But every visitor who found their way to the Midnight Garden Cafe came for a reason, even if they didn't know it yet. The faint crunch of gravel came from outside. Ezra looked up as a shadow crossed the doorway. A man stepped in, soaked from the drizzle that had started again beyond the trees. His coat was worn, his eyes lined with years of unspoken things, and in his hand, he carried a folded piece of paper that looked as though it had been opened and closed too many times. Ezra said nothing at first. He simply nodded toward the nearest chair. The man hesitated, then sat down heavily, letting out a long, uneven breath. "I wasn't planning to stop," he said finally. "I thought I'd just keep driving." But the road disappeared into fog, and then I saw the lights. "That's how most people find this place," Ezra replied softly, pouring tea into a cup. "The road tends to bring them here when it knows they need rest." The man gave a weary chuckle. "Rest," he said under his breath. "I haven't done that in years." Ezra slid the cup toward him, the scent of chamomile and orange peel rising like a quiet exhale. "Then perhaps tonight you will." The man took a sip and let his eyes close. "This reminds me of my mother," he said. "She used to make tea for me when I couldn't sleep, said that the warmth would calm the ghosts in my chest." "Did it work?" Ezra asked gently. "Sometimes," the man said. "But she's gone now, and the ghosts don't like to be quiet anymore." Ezra didn't answer immediately. The cat leapt onto the windowsill, watching the rain slide down the glass, its purring barely audible. The sound filled the silence like a lullaby. "Some ghosts aren't meant to be silenced," Ezra said at last. "Some just need to be heard." The man looked at him then, his eyes glinting faintly in the firelight. "Heard by who?" "By yourself," Ezra said simply. "By someone who remembers. By a night that's kind enough to listen." For a while the man said nothing. He unfolded the paper he'd been carrying and stared at it. The ink had smudged from water, and parts of it were unreadable. But Ezra caught a few words when the man laid it on the table. "I'm sorry, and I'll come back." The man reached up to wipe his eyes, though no tears had yet fallen. "It's a letter from my son," he said quietly. "He sent it years ago. We argued the day he left. I never answered him. He died last winter. A car accident." The wind moved through the open window, stirring the candle flames. Ezra didn't move closer, but his presence was steady, solid in the stillness. "He wrote that letter because he hoped you would forgive him," he said softly. "But forgiveness isn't something that ends with one person. It lives between hearts, waiting for both to rest." The man stared at the letter for a long time. "I don't know how to forgive myself," he whispered. "Then let tonight forgive you," Ezra said. "That's what this place is for." Outside, the rain began to fade. turning into a soft drizzle that fell like whispers across the roof. The man sat there long after his tea had cooled, eyes distant but softer than before. The fire flickered low, and the cat hopped down from the windowsill to curl up beside his chair, as if guarding him from whatever pain might still linger. When he finally stood to leave, he left the letter behind, folded neatly on the table. Ezra didn't move to pick it up. He simply watched as the man stepped outside, his figure merging with the mist. The door closed gently behind him, and the cafe returned to its quiet rhythm, the steady ticking of the clock, the crackle of the fire, the purring of the cat. Ezra looked at the letter once more. The ink shimmered faintly as though alive, and he could swear he heard a whisper, faint as breath. "Thank you." He smiled and turned back to the window. The rain had stopped completely now. The lake outside gleamed like glass, and the garden glistened beneath the lanterns that had begun to flicker on. The flowers seemed to lean toward the cafe as though listening. The entire world was breathing in unison, soft and slow. As the night deepened, more candles were lit. Their glow spilled across the tables, warm and golden. The scent of tea and jasmine hung in the air. Ezra poured himself a cup and sat by the window, watching the moon climb over the hills. Somewhere far away, an owl called once, and then there was silence, peaceful, endless silence. In that silence, the cafe seemed to hum with quiet life. It was as though every story told within its walls still lived there, whispering softly through the floorboards, floating between the walls like invisible threads of light. Ezra listened as he always did, his heart full but unburdened. Every tear shed here became part of the stillness. Every broken word became a seed for gentler tomorrows. And when the night was at its deepest, and the stars glowed silver across the lake, Ezra closed his eyes and let the world blur into quiet. He thought of all the travelers who would one day arrive, drawn by light they could not explain, seeking peace they could not name. The Midnight Garden Cafe would wait for them, as it always had, as it always would. Steady as a heartbeat, calm as moonlight, patient as love that never fades. The moon climbed higher above the lake, its reflection trembling slightly in the ripples that brushed against the shore. The wind had quieted to a sigh, and the world seemed to pause between heartbeats. Inside the cafe, the candles burned lower, their flames fluttering like tired wings. Ezra sat still, a cup cradled between his palms, its warmth seeping into his skin as if reminding him that the night, for all its silence, was alive. The cat purred softly beside him, its rhythmic breathing blending with the faint hum of the clock and the crackle of the dying fire. He watched as the mist began to gather again across the water, drifting closer like a slow tide. In that silver haze, the lights of the cafe shimmered faintly, almost as though the world were dreaming itself anew. He thought of the visitors who had come through the door over the years, some broken, some lost, some simply tired. They had all left pieces of themselves behind. Laughter, tears, letters, whispers, fragments of love. The cafe held them all. It was built on their stories as much as on wood and stone. Ezra rose slowly and moved to the counter, where an old journal lay open. He turned its pages with care. Each one was filled with notes, names, dates, small sketches, words of gratitude or sorrow. The journal had begun long before him, passed from one keeper to another, each adding their own memories. The Midnight Garden Cafe had stood here for over 100 years, though not always in the same place. Sometimes it vanished for seasons at a time, only to reappear beside a lake or a forest, or at the end of a forgotten road. It always appeared where it was needed most. He wrote a few lines on the last empty page. The man with the letter found peace tonight. The rain washed his grief away, and the lake listened. He paused, then added, the night was kind. Closing the book, he placed it back beneath the counter, resting his hand on the worn cover for a moment. The surface felt warm, as though the stories inside were still breathing. The air shifted gently, and he felt the faintest brush of presence, something like a sigh or a whisper. The cafe often spoke in its own way, not with words but through feelings, through the hush that lingered after a visitor left. Tonight it felt peaceful, content. Ezra turned toward the window again. Beyond the mist, A faint glow shimmered on the far side of the lake. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw another light flicker in answer, a small golden gleam like a lantern held by unseen hands. Perhaps it was another traveler finding their way through the fog. Perhaps it was simply the stars reflected on the water. Either way, he smiled. He walked to the door and stepped outside, the air crisp against his skin. The garden surrounded the cafe in a quiet circle of light. Lanterns hung from branches, their glass catching the moonlight and scattering it across the petals of night-blooming flowers. The scent of lavender and damp earth filled the air. Fireflies drifted lazily above the grass, their glow pulsing in time with the soft rhythm of the night. The lake stretched out beyond the garden, vast and calm, its surface smooth as glass. The mountains in the distance were only faint outlines, pale ghosts under the silver sky. Ezra sat on the steps, feeling the wooden boards cool beneath him. He let his breath fall into the same rhythm as the water's soft lap against the shore. Every inhale felt like drawing in the world, every exhale like giving it back. In moments like this, he thought of the first time he had found the cafe. He had been young, lost, wandering after something he could not name. The night had been just as still, and when he had seen the lanterns glowing through the fog, he had felt as though the stars themselves had led him there. The cafe had offered him tea, warmth, and silence. It had given him a place to listen to his own heartbeat again. And when the previous keeper left, he had asked Ezra to stay. That was many winters ago. He had never once thought of leaving since. The cafe was not simply a place, it was a living memory, a soft dream in a loud world. A breeze rose from the lake, carrying with it the faintest music. It was hard to tell if it came from the trees, the water, or the stars themselves. The melody was fragile, almost too quiet to hear, but it made his heart ache gently, like remembering something beautiful you can't return to. He looked toward the horizon, where the first blush of dawn was beginning to form, pale pink brushing against the dark. He stood and turned back toward the cafe. Through the window, the cat had climbed onto the counter, curling itself into a circle of soft fur. The candles had burned down to stubs. The clock ticked quietly, marking the approach of morning. Ezra opened the door and stepped inside, letting the warmth wrap around him like a blanket. The air smelled of tea and wood smoke, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly still. He whispered softly to himself, "Rest well, little place." The words hung in the air for a moment before fading into the gentle hum of the room. He banked the fire, blew out the last candle, and poured the final drops of tea into his cup. Steam rose like a ghost before vanishing. Outside, the mist began to thin, and through it, the lake shimmered faintly in the dawn light. Ezra took one last look around the room. The shadows were long, stretching across the floorboards, touching the tables where countless strangers had sat and found comfort. Every mark, every faint scratch in the wood told a story. He smiled. Then he set his cup down and whispered, "Until the next traveler." The cafe seemed to sigh in response. A soft creak of wood, a flicker of the lanterns, the faint scent of blooming jasmine. Then all fell quiet. The midnight garden cafe waited once more. Wrapped in stillness, its doors opened to whoever might lose their way in the night. The light outside grew slowly, golden and soft, spilling over the hills and touching the garden with warmth. The lake glowed like glass. The wind stirred the flowers. The world woke, unaware of the magic that lingered at the edge of the mist. And somewhere far away, a traveler followed a winding road through the forest, weary and unsure, until they saw a glow through the trees, a small golden light waiting patiently, like a promise kept. The road, as always, had brought them home. The morning light arrived gently, without rush or noise, brushing the horizon in hues of soft amber and pale gold. The mist that had blanketed the lake began to dissolve, curling upward like breath in cold air. The garden surrounding the cafe stirred with life. Dewdrops clung to the petals of the white lilies that grew by the path, each one catching the light and scattering it like tiny diamonds. The world was in no hurry to wake, and neither was the cafe. Everything existed in that fragile moment between night and morning, where time felt suspended, where even a sigh could echo forever. Inside, Ezra moved quietly, his steps soft against the wooden floor. He opened the windows to let in the crisp air, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The cat stretched lazily on the counter, yawning before curling up again, content to let the sunlight wash over its fur. The teapots on the shelves gleamed faintly, and the glass jars that lined the wall caught the light like jewels, lavender buds, dried chamomile, peppermint leaves, and rose petals resting in stillness. The faintest hum filled the air, like the soft vibration of something ancient and alive. Ezra began to prepare a new pot of tea, though there was no one yet to drink it. It was a ritual more than a task, a way of greeting the morning, of acknowledging the stillness before the day began. Steam rose in slow curls, disappearing into the golden light. He watched it for a long time, feeling the warmth seep through his fingers. The cafe was at its quietest at dawn, and those moments always felt sacred, as though the world itself paused to listen. Outside, a bird called once, breaking the silence. The sound was clear and gentle, echoing over the water. Ezra smiled. He poured himself a cup and sat by the window, watching the light grow stronger. The reflection of the cafe shimmered on the lake, as if two worlds existed side by side, the real and the imagined, the waking and the dreaming. Sometimes he wondered which one he lived in. Sometimes he thought they were the same. The cafe's magic was not loud or sudden. It did not shimmer with spells or glittering dust. Its magic was quiet, built from the weight of small kindnesses, of shared words and soft silences. It was a place that healed not by changing the world, but by allowing people to rest in it. Ezra had learned this over the years, though he never stopped marveling at it. He thought of the man from the night before, the letter left behind, the way his shoulders had softened before he left. He hoped the man was sleeping now, somewhere warm, the burden of his sorrow a little lighter. The cafe's work was never about answers. It was about pauses, those rare, fragile pauses in which a person could breathe again. The breeze carried the scent of morning across the garden. The lilies turned their faces toward the sun. A thin veil of mist still lingered above the water, curling like smoke. Ezra sipped his tea, feeling the warmth move through him. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply, and when he opened them again, the light had shifted slightly, deeper and softer. The day was truly beginning. He stood and went outside, the wood of the steps cool beneath his bare feet. The garden sparkled with dew, each leaf holding a drop of light. The lanterns that had burned through the night were now dim, their flames gone but their glass still warm. Ezra walked among them, touching each one lightly, as if to thank it for keeping watch. The flowers whispered as he passed, the sound of their petals brushing together soft as silk. The lake stretched endlessly before him, and for a moment, it seemed like the edge of the world. He could almost believe that beyond it lay something vast and endless, a place where the sky met the water, where all the lost stories of the world drifted and found peace. He liked to think that when people left the cafe, their pain did not vanish but softened, dissolving into that wide quiet. A small ripple appeared on the surface of the lake, spreading outward in perfect circles. He followed it with his eyes and saw a pair of swans gliding toward the reeds. Their movement was so smooth it was almost unreal, as though they were part of the water itself. Ezra smiled faintly. The swans had come every morning that he could remember. They belonged to the lake as surely as the cafe did. He lingered outside for a while, breathing in the cool air, before returning inside. The fire had burned low during the night, so he added a few small logs, watching as the flames caught and began to dance again. The cat stirred, blinking slowly, then leapt from the counter and stretched. Ezra reached down to scratch its head. "Morning, Ash," he whispered. The cat purred and brushed against his hand before padding toward the sunlit corner near the window. For a long time, he simply stood there, listening to the sound of the fire and the wind against the glass. The rhythm of it was steady, comforting. The cafe seemed to breathe along with him, the air expanding and contracting as though the walls themselves were alive. It had always been like that. The cafe was not just a place, it was a presence. It held the quiet patience of something ancient, something that had seen countless nights and endless mornings, yet never grew old. The clock above the counter ticked softly, marking time that didn't quite matter. Ezra took another sip of tea and let his mind drift. He thought of the many faces that had passed through this room, the young woman who came with a broken journal, the old sailor who dreamed of oceans he could no longer see, the child who once believed the stars were messages meant only for her. Each of them had left something behind. A word, a tear, a smile. The cafe had kept them all. As the sun climbed higher, The mist faded entirely, revealing the full stretch of the lake and the gentle rise of the forest beyond. The light filled the room completely now, spilling across the floorboards, turning dust motes into floating gold. Ezra leaned against the counter and closed his eyes. The world outside moved slowly, but here time felt like water, calm, endless, always returning. The cafe would wait again for nightfall, for the next traveler who might need warmth, a story, or simply the sound of silence. It would light its lanterns and open its doors, just as it always had, just as it always would. For now it rested, breathing in the day, holding the memory of every soul that had crossed its threshold. Ezra whispered almost to himself, "Sleep well, little world." His voice was low and steady, the kind that carried into dreams. The sound lingered in the air, a gentle hum, before fading into the stillness. The garden swayed in the morning breeze. The cat sighed in its sleep. The teapot steamed quietly on the counter. And in that perfect calm the cafe seemed to smile, its heartbeat soft, steady, eternal. The day drifted forward softly, the kind of morning that felt as though the world had forgotten to hurry. The sunlight grew richer, sliding slowly across the lake until the water shone like glass touched with gold. The faint rustle of leaves carried through the open window, mingling with the quiet sound of boiling water and the tender creak of the wooden floorboards. Ezra's movements remained unhurried. Everything he did seemed to belong to a rhythm much older and calmer than time itself. He poured another cup of tea and watched the steam rise, curling like a ghost before fading into the still air. The cafe was bathed in soft light now, a living painting of warmth and silence. Shadows shifted across the walls, gentle and slow. The cat had returned to the windowsill, eyes half closed, tail twitching lazily. Its soft purr blended into the background like a heartbeat, too faint to hear but too constant to miss. The air smelled of pine and citrus and something faintly sweet. The lake beyond the window rippled as a breeze touched its surface, the faintest sigh of water brushing the shore. Ezra leaned on the counter, his eyes unfocused, as though seeing far beyond what was there. His thoughts wandered like the mist that came and went, never rushed, never forced, always drifting. He thought of the visitors who had passed through the cafe's door, the way they had each carried something heavy and left a little lighter. The cafe had a way of finding people, or perhaps people had a way of finding it, only when they were ready to stop. Some arrived soaked from the rain. Others came trembling from cold or grief. A few came smiling, though their eyes told stories of loneliness. The cafe took them all in without question. It offered warmth, and in return, it was filled with fragments of their stories. Ezra always felt that those stories lingered in the walls, invisible but breathing, resting quietly until they were ready to let go. The sunlight shifted again, growing softer as the day leaned toward afternoon. Ezra opened the back door that led into the garden. The scent of flowers poured in, rich and heady. The blooms turned lazily in the breeze, and the soft buzz of bees rose and fell like a gentle lullaby. He stepped outside and walked among the rows of plants, brushing his fingers over their petals, whispering to them as though greeting old friends. The flowers swayed in reply, their movements slow and graceful. The garden was an extension of the cafe, a living, breathing part of it. Every flower here had once been planted by a visitor. Some had planted seeds to honor someone they'd lost, others to mark the start of something new. Over time, the garden had grown wild and full, an untamed symphony of life that glowed under moonlight and shimmered beneath the sun. Ezra could name every flower, every vine, every patch of herbs. They were all memories that had rooted themselves into the soil. He knelt near a patch of blue asters, brushing away a few fallen leaves. The soil was damp, cool beneath his fingertips. He stayed there for a long moment, eyes closed, listening. The world was never truly silent. Even stillness had its voice. The rustle of distant trees, the sigh of the lake, the hum of tiny wings. Everything spoke softly in the language of calm. When he rose, the sun had shifted again. It filtered through the branches, scattering dappled light across his face. He could feel its warmth, soft and forgiving. He made his way back to the cafe, the wooden boards creaking slightly beneath his steps. Inside, the air was still warm from the fire. He added another log and watched as the flames caught, their light dancing across the room like lazy fireflies. He sat at one of the tables and began to write in his journal. His handwriting was slow, each word placed with care. He did not write stories in the usual sense. Instead, he recorded fragments, the feeling of the morning air, the sound of rain against the windows, the scent of tea when the night grew quiet. He wrote about the visitors too, though never their names, only what lingered after they left. A man who forgave himself after 20 winters. A woman who learned to breathe again. A child who dreamed of stars. The cafe seemed to hum faintly as he wrote, as though the air itself approved. He paused and listened, his pen hovering above the page. The wind moved through the open window, brushing the curtains and carrying with it the sound of the lake. He closed his eyes, breathing in deeply. The warmth of the tea in his hands, the softness of the air, the sound of the water. It all blurred together into something that felt like peace. He stayed that way until the light began to fade. The day slipped away quietly, and the colors of evening began to bloom. The lake turned silver, and the first stars trembled faintly above the horizon. Ezra rose and lit the lanterns one by one, their glow soft and golden. The cafe transformed again, shifting from day to night, from reality to dream. The flicker of candlelight made the walls shimmer, and for a moment, it seemed as though the whole room exhaled. He brewed one final pot of tea for the night. The scent filled the air, calm and soothing. He poured a cup, letting the warmth spill across his palms. Outside, the garden shimmered beneath the lanterns. The flowers swayed gently, their petals glowing like small moons. The reflection of the cafe lights rippled across the lake, each shimmer a heartbeat, each ripple a whisper. Ezra sat once more by the window, watching as night folded itself around the world. The stars deepened, their light soft and steady. The cat climbed into his lap and settled there, a small weight of warmth and life. He stroked its fur absently, his thoughts quiet. The night outside was vast, and yet it felt close, intimate, as though the universe itself was leaning in to listen. He closed his eyes and breathed. The cafe breathed with him. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the sound drifted across the lake like a lullaby. He could feel sleep tugging at the edges of his thoughts, gentle and kind. The warmth of the tea, the hush of the night, the soft pulse of the world. It all blended into a rhythm that asked nothing but surrender. He whispered into the quiet, "Rest now." The words melted into the stillness, carried outward on the air, across the lake, through the trees, into the endless calm. The world listened. The stars glimmered. The cafe waited. And slowly, softly, everything fell into peace, deep, boundless, eternal peace. And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close. But your night continues, calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest. For the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000/.